Hi, I'm Corey Reeser, and I'm doing my first fieldwork reflection on the Articles of Confederation lesson that I taught. Before I get started off, I first want to identify that I am teaching at Chaffee High School, which has a total population of 3,794 students. It's located in Ontario, California. The demographics are 86.5% Hispanic, 6.8% white, 2.6% African American, and 2.2% Pacific Islander or Asian. The classroom that I'm in is a classroom. It's an American government class for seniors. So I teach American government and economics to 12th grade seniors at Chaffee High School. The classroom environment, in terms of the physical space, is actually I have both sides, or my master teacher has both sides of the classroom facing directly into the center, where myself and my master teacher, Jeff Brown, provide the instruction for the day's lesson. The students, they basically, these are, like I identified before, they're high school seniors. In my first period class, half of them have some type of EL designation. So it's important, basically, especially within that first period class, that I take the extra time to put in the appropriate instructional skills for EL and special needs students that have a really hard time moving through the material and moving through the requirements in American government and economics. So basically the beginning of this, so that's basically the framework of the classroom that I teach in. So here's the Articles of Confederation lesson. How I incorporated this was the first lesson that I taught for this class in an urban setting, and I hadn't really been able to identify, urban, or the fundamentals of urban life to this point. But that is actually a progression that I made throughout the course that I'll identify in the later screencast. So basically incorporating the application of theory into this lesson, which I will go over in just a second, from part 2 of the book. It just basically identifies how I become an urban school teacher. And moving through this, you will see it's basically making connections and using humor with the students, because what I have personally found is that regardless of the geographic location and demographics of the school, when humor is used appropriately, students will learn because they laugh. So here's the Articles of Confederation lesson that I developed. First off, I start off by a review of the Articles of Confederation lesson, PowerPoint presentation for the Articles of Confederation, and a group activity. So here's my objective: that students will understand the primary mechanisms and issues that led to the revision of the Articles of Confederation, and they will identify the positive and negative attributes of the Articles of Confederation. So start off, there's a quick YouTube video that I won't show here that basically introduces the Articles of Confederation to the students. That was basically to address the EL requirements for this class. Here's the beginning of why did the Articles of Confederation fail, and I progressively move through these elements with the students while using references that they're actually familiar with, or concepts that they would be familiar with. Because one problem that I had at the beginning for my 460 and 470 courses was I was talking over the students and not using frame of references that they were particularly familiar with. So when we talk about debt, for example, I was able to use a reference of how you accrue debt. So basically using a local reference point of if you want to buy a house or if you want to start up a local business. That was one of the examples I used so the students would be able to have an urban frame of reference. So basically I just move them through. This is the content material of the PowerPoint instructional, and it discusses the various aspects of the Articles of Confederation and why it was basically dismantled. And then after this, I had them move through an Articles of Confederation worksheet, which basically the students were required to identify one aspect of the Articles of Confederation that they would like to fix, and then they would compare that with the revisions that were conducted by the Founding Fathers. So that was my first Field Week reflection. Hi, I'm Corey Reeser, and this is my second screencast reflection for my fieldwork observations that are tied into the lesson that I taught regarding the Bill of Rights for the 5 pedagogical lessons that are required to have been taught in EDU 476. So I taught this lesson on the Bill of Rights. I actually divided this up into 2 segments because the Bill of Rights covers Amendments 1 through 10 to the U.S. Constitution. And in order to address the EL and special needs requirements for my first period class, which is what I'm offering a reflection for, being that there are, I believe 12 EL or special needs students in that class, it was pretty advantageous of myself to divide this up into 2 segments. That way, those students would be able to develop a fundamental understanding of the content material, and that I would be able to provide the necessary reinforcement that they would need in order to meet the requirements for the daily objective. So, like I've identified previously in my first period class, that's my American government. This is not an econ class. This is my American government class. I do not teach all American government. I actually have them divided into American government and econ. But for the purposes of this reflection, the Bill of Rights, I actually incorporated the application of theory, basically knowing my students. So my background in law is not really, my background in law, my background as an undergrad, and my background growing up are not any way reflective of the students that I teach. So basically, in order to communicate this material, which was written by a bunch of white guys, I had to modify and refine my skills and really think about how I was going to communicate the core concepts of the Bill of Rights, because from a student's perspective who's Hispanic or Latino, they're just a grouping of words that represent a paragraph and some type of archaic legal concept. And in order for me to break down that barrier, I had to formulate reference points for the students regarding their surrounding communities that they would be familiar with, and give them concepts that they would be familiar with. So if a right was violated, it wouldn't be very appropriate for myself to use a circumstance or scenario that the students would not be familiar with in any shape or form. So if I'm using securities fraud, students wouldn't even know what securities fraud is, because none of their parents most likely are heavily involved in stock market purchasing and selling. So the Bill of Rights, lesson 1 through 5. Here's the agenda. I start off with a PowerPoint introduction to constitutional interpretation. This is important because it identifies how the Supreme Court justices, who are the final say when it comes to constitutional law, how they apply different methods of constitutional interpretation and what those methods are and what they could possibly look like. I then give a PowerPoint presentation for amendments 1 through 5 and analysis of those very amendments. And then I led the class, a pretty significant classroom discussion on the limitations of amendments 1 through 5. And the purpose of this was basically I would throw out a question or a hypothetical, and if students didn't answer appropriately, I would start calling on students and asking them, what do you think? What are your opinions regarding this scenario, and do they agree or disagree with the conclusion that was made? So this is basically a way of allowing the students to ask questions, especially the EL students, from a reference point that they are familiar with. So if I used a legal concept that they were unfamiliar with, they could simply raise their hand and say, how was this aspect of this amendment, how does that reference to this situation? So that was the whole purpose of the classroom discussion on amendments 1 through 5. So start off, here's the objective that I used for the students, that they would understand the primary applications of amendments 1 through 5 of the U.S. Constitution, and that they would be able to identify the primary methods of constitutional interpretation. So here was my introduction to constitutional interpretation. I went over text analysis, precedent, constitutional doctrine, logical reasoning, the living constitution, and reliance on foreign law. And I did this because basically, this wasn't actually covered in the book that the students have, but I felt that this was extremely important because in one of my law courses that I had taken as when I was working toward my law degree, this was a fundamental aspect of understanding the Constitution, is you have to understand it from the standpoint of what the Supreme Court uses as means of interpretation. So, for example, precedent would be using a previous court decision's opinion to reinforce or legitimize a current court decision. Reliance on foreign law would be basically, what do other countries do, and we should apply that very same legal thinking to the U.S. Constitution. And I told my students that anyone can basically say that's unconstitutional, or, the Constitution doesn't merit that, but I told them that it is important to realize that if they want to make a legitimate claim on constitutional law, they have to use at least one of these 6 requirements for constitutional interpretation, or else it's just their unfounded, unverifiable opinion. So, and original understanding, which is 7 of them. And then as I move through, once I identified this is how they are, or how the amendments to the Constitution would be interpreted by a jurist of the court, I went into the background of the Revolution, and then I used, it's an actual preview. It's a 2-minute and 30-second preview on the Ukrainian Revolution called Winter on Fire. And I showed the students this, basically displaying the Ukrainian Revolution to provide context on how they actually used the American Declaration of Independence, directly quoted the American Declaration of Independence in their own declaration against the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. So then I went through the amendments. As you can see, John Oliver, and I like to use a lot of funny quotes just so it draws these students' attention into the content. So it basically, instead of just like, write this down, I provide them like, there's this, and then here's something funny that actually is reference to what we are discussing. So I actually put a lot of time and effort in finding comical visuals that basically align themselves with the content material that I'm discussing. So I go through the amendments. I provide the actual text of the amendments, as you can see. So you have the actual text, and then I give an overview. So the purpose of this is so the students can see what the actual text of the amendment is like in legal terms. And then this is a more basic and fundamental view of the amendment process. So this is the moment of Zen, basically talking. It was a funny video from The Daily Show discussing the Second Amendment. So that was just some fun stuff for the students to kind of break up the lesson a little bit. And then you continue to move through each of the amendment processes. And I eventually came to the Fifth Amendment, and as you can see, there was a lot of material involved in this, so I spent a significant amount of time reinforcing the concepts of each amendment. And I found it pretty well served to actually interject videos that kind of reinforce what I'm trying to do, especially with urban students, because it gives them another frame of reference on top of what I'm already doing. And another important aspect to consider in terms of application of theory was that knowing students and meeting their needs was reflected in my ability to transfer archaic and meaningless information into relevant material that they could interact with and understand on a meaningful level. So that was my second reflection for EDU 476 Fieldwork Observations. So this is my third Field Week observational reflection for Education 476 Practicum unit, so the 5 units that I'm required to teach. This one is done on the Bill of Rights, so Amendments 6 through 10, and this was done the day after that I provided instruction on the Bill of Rights Amendments 1 through 5. So this was the lesson on the day after that I instructed Amendments 1 through 5 to my first period class for American government, and that's what this reflection is offered within the context of my first period American government classroom. So just a brief overview this is at Chaffee High School. Classroom is about 36 students. 12 of them are designated EL. And I actually spend a significant amount of time prepping my lessons for those EL students because they do have a significant impediment when it comes to understanding and reproducing the core concepts that I want them to achieve within the overall context of the lesson itself. So to get things started with this lesson, I went straight into, it was basically the same objective from the day before, and I went straight into Amendment 6. So as you can see, with this instruction, it was the same format that I used for Amendments 1 through 5. The difference is with Amendment 8, I spent a lot of time on the 8th Amendment because this was capital punishment. And this was actually a pretty contentious area because a lot of my students directly or indirectly know someone who is in prison. And then a few of them do know or have a relative who is on death row. So this is a pretty hot topic, and the purpose of this for myself was talking about basically introducing key concepts of race and racism, especially into the curriculum, because I identified the racial aspects, which are a part of the requirements from Part 4 of the reading. I gave them the statistics for death row and gave them a scenario of myself committing a crime and one of my Hispanic students committing the exact same crime, and the probability of the Hispanic student getting the death penalty, and then the probability of myself receiving 10 to 15 years with the possibility of parole at 10. So I used this analogy to show basically that cruel and unusual punishment, which capital punishment is categorized under, or that is the argument. This is a list of all of the countries that still impose the death penalty. And I also identified that the only other Western country, Belarus, implemented the death penalty basically as a means to execute a couple of terrorists. So other than that, the United States is in some unwanted company when it comes to the amount of individuals we execute, or the fact that we do have the death penalty. But this actually wasn't the most persuasive argument, which I thought would be. The most persuasive argument was the discrepancy in demographics between those on death row and those incarcerated from the standpoint of ethnicity. It wasn't the fact that we were, in the same company as Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It was just the gross social injustices within the context of America itself and the racial divides that still exist in today's society. So that was one of the more enriching topics that we discussed, that intertwined elements of the text from Part 4, and it was a great application of theory that I was able to interject into the lesson itself. And then another thing was that, basically developing my curriculum within the context of an urban setting, I used a lot of urban examples for for the content material. So when you're dealing with Amendment 9, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This protects an individual citizens that are not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. So I can use an example that, marijuana, and this is actually an example I use, could be given Ninth Amendment protections. And in the amendment, or in the policy proposal project, I actually let two of my students develop a marijuana policy proposal based off of Ninth Amendment protections. So it was just using things that they would be familiar with, as opposed to, the Ninth Amendment protects my right to do this, this, and this within the context of government or business. So I have to make it much more basic and much more relevant and understandable. And the Bill of Rights group project and class presentation. So this is what the students had to do. They had to organize themselves into groups of 4 to 5. They were each required to choose an amendment to research, no more than 2 groups per amendment. Once the group received an approval to begin the research on current events that directly related to the chosen amendment, they then were selecting one current event to use for their in-class presentation, research the event, and record the areas of constitutional contention. Upon completion of the worksheet, the students were required to develop a poster board presentation to display in class. Now, the purpose of this was basically making content relevant. I wanted the students to research a current event that they could associate with or understand on a fundamental level and relate it to the area of constitutional contention that reflects their that reflects. Hi, my name is Corey Reeser, and this is my 4th reflection for my fieldwork observations for the practicum unit for Education 476. So this lesson that I taught was taught on March 14th, 2016, and it was the Create-A-Bill group activity that was actually taught in relationship to the Bill of Rights lessons that I provided instruction for. So basically this was the collaborative process or the collaborative aspect of the lesson, which the students would, as I'll describe further, they would basically assemble themselves in groups and then implement the major themes that we learned in the Bill of Rights and the how a bill becomes law activity that I did with them prior. So this was all done within the context of first period American government at Chaffee High School. As discussed previously, the age high school seniors, 12 EL students in the class of 36. And I actually had to, in this process, 2 of my EL students I allowed to work together against my better judgment, and they actually ended up producing one of the better bills that was introduced during the group activity. So when you're talking about, I went through the agenda to start things off. Basically, introduction to the Create-A-Bill group activity, the congressional group selection, which was basically the students are required to assemble in groups, and this basically represents a congressional group, such as the most recent one was the Gang of 8 that develop a proposal and submit it to Congress. They have to choose a current event in which they want to address an issue that involves the Bill of Rights, so amendments 1 through 10, and this was done in conjunction with their current event. They could utilize their current event that was done during the Bill of Rights lesson 6 through 10 computer lab assignment. They were then required to create their bill based off of their research. I actually provided them with a worksheet that guided them through the bill creation process. So subsection 1, or you have sections 1, 2, 3, subsection 1A, so on and so forth. And all of this was done to basically enhance my students' understanding of how a law, so how a law basically is drafted to begin with, and then how within the context of amendment, how there are various things that address various aspects of a certain situation. I then provided, they were then required to create their final version, and they had to submit it for credit. The final version actually incorporated a PowerPoint presentation, which was utilized in order to enhance the effectiveness of their argument as to why Congress, which in this case would be the 36 students in the class, myself being the president, basically it offers an advertisement as to why I should or should not pass this piece of legislation. So they had to introduce it, as we'll go on within the discussion of the lesson. So here's the objective: that by the end of the lesson, students will be able to research and analyze a current event or issue and create a piece of legislation, a bill, that provides a legal resolution. Students will design a 2 to 5 slide PowerPoint presentation to introduce their bill to the class. The students will provide an analysis of their bill in order to persuade the class to vote for their legislation. So this is what the students were required to do, and actually all of the groups were able to achieve this lesson objective for the Create a Bill activity. So here was the situation that I gave them. Funny picture on the right, situation from the Jersey Shore. You are a member of Congress and a legislative body of 36 representatives. You and 2 other members of Congress have decided that in order to solve a problem, you are going to write a bill and present it to Congress. Your bill must be persuasive, since it must be passed by a majority vote in the House and Senate. If all goes well and your bill passes and is signed by President Reeser, myself, then your bill will become law. So the players: Mr. Reeser, I'm the president. CC and Andy are 2 TAs that I have. CC acted as my chief of staff, and Andy acted as my political advisor. And this was actually kind of fun because we sat in the middle of the class, and as the students were producing their argument and their PowerPoint slides, I actually let CC and Andy, basically like, hey, should I sign this as the president? What do you think? And I kind of removed myself from the situation and still allowed my TAs, who were also seniors, to involve themselves in the class. The students were the representatives of Congress, and they were the ones required to move their bill basically through an archaic version of the committee process onto the floor of the House, and then onto the president for signature and passage into law. The rules were that each group can be no more than 4 individuals. Each group must research an issue to resolve. Each group must develop a law that directly relates to the chosen issue, and they must submit a written form of the law on the activity worksheet that I provided them. They have to provide any supporting details and information that enhances their legal argument as well in order to get their bill passed. Each group must develop a PowerPoint slide of 2 to 5 slides to convince a 51% majority of Congress to pass the law. So we were going by simple majority. Here are the directions that I provided to the students. And then, as you can see, it basically just provides another overview of what the students were required to do. And an application of theory for this process was basically testing objectivity, and then implementing subjective factors and grading. So it was basically my responsibility. I had the rubrics printed out for each group and my master teacher actually used it as a part of their actual grade to assess whether the students were able to identify the major parts in the objective and whether they met the requirements that were identified in the grading rubric itself. So this was an application of theory for part 5, just in the fact that I tested their ability through formative assessment regarding their understanding and comprehension of amendments 1 through 10 and how a bill is developed and becomes law in the American legal system. And that is my reflection for Education 476. Hi, my name is Corey Reeser, and this is my 5th and final fieldwork observation for the EDU 476 Fieldwork Practicum unit. This one I taught in the computer lab. I actually requested this because I did this in conjunction with a federalism lesson that my master teacher had taught and that the students weren't really getting the concept of. So my master teacher actually provided this to me as a means of, or this just day's lesson to enhance the effectiveness of federalism content material instruction. Brief backdrop, the school is at Chaffee High School. The classroom is 36 students in my first period class, all consisting of high school seniors ranging from ages 17 to 18 years old. There are 12 EL students in this class, and in this particular situation for this particular activity in the computer lab, I actually like to designate my EL students in one section of the computer lab. That way I don't have to pop around all over the computer lab between my EL students to explain the same thing. They're all in the same area, and if I need to show them something on the computer or how to access a legitimate source on whatever they're researching, in this case federalism, they're all in the same location and all can watch me, and it doesn't require as much investment of my time. So it's just a classroom management skill at a basic level. Before I get started into what I did, I want to talk about the application of theory of part 6 of the reading. And basically, this incorporates that my strategies for mitigating uncertainty was just identified with basically, I wouldn't say segregating, but grouping my EL students in one area. That way I can deal with the amount of effort that has to go into each student, within pairs of 2 or 3 within the same setting, and may not even have to go that much further because all the students still have the ability to hear me give instruction. So that's one way of mitigating what would otherwise be an extremely time-inducive aspect of my classroom management, and I wouldn't necessarily be able to give much time to the other 24 students in my class. So I had to constantly balance my considerations between my EL and special needs students and the rest of the students in the class who still deserve the same attention that I'm giving the others. One more note that I would like to share would be just a dilemma of practice, especially within the context of this lesson, had to do with the students' understanding of what the content material is and then the direct application of that content material in terms of researching a current event. So when you're dealing with federalism, I identified this was the same PowerPoint I used during the activity. It's the constitutional relationship between state and federal governments of the United States, and basically how they interact with one another. And going further, the current event, here's the guidelines. I wanted the students to research a current event where federalism is a part of the issue. What I didn't really basically come into the lesson prepared to deal with was the students being able to apply federalism into and plug it into the elements of the current event. So how to transfer, okay, what's a state and local controversy in current terms. And I was actually quite surprised that many of my students didn't really know, well, federalism, state and local, and the federal government. So where are they arguing? They didn't really know how to transfer that into a current event, or that concept into a current event. So I had to go through the process with all of my EL students and many of my non-EL students as well to describe to them, hey, this is how you apply a learning concept into a real world scenario. So that was something I had to actually set aside time for, and that was one teaching dilemma of practice that I really hadn't considered because they were high school seniors, and I figured they would already have these educational skills with them when they entered this project. So I then, once they researched their current event on federalism, I had them identify the title and URL of their article. This was all based off of the worksheet that was provided to them. They were then required to identify the state and federal disagreement. So the state and feds are disagreeing. Why are they disagreeing? One I guess one example I believe I provided, yes, I provided later on that I'll go into. I provided the students with 2 examples on possible ideas they could use, but only one group could use the examples provided. So they were next basically required to research that article, and I wanted them to identify if the article was argumentative or informative. So did the article that they were reading regarding the state and federal dispute, I really emphasized, did they think that the article was trying to persuade them to take a position, or did it simply provide information and leave the opinion up to the reader? And this was another element that I actually came prepared to guide my students through, because I had previously run into this problem when having my students try and develop an argument itself. They didn't know the difference between persuasive and informative arguments. So I had to guide them through the process of, some key indicators of what would be an argumentative essay and what would be an informative essay. They were then supposed to identify why the article was written and the position the author takes. So that is almost answered within the argumentative informative portion. So does the author take a position, or does he simply provide information? They were then supposed to identify how the current event relates to federalism, so applying basically the content material to their situation, so applying the application of the theory of federalism into a current event. And they were required to give a brief opinion regarding whether or not this article changed their position on that current event. And this was actually the most important piece that I wanted them to write up on, because I wanted to hear what they thought based off of the information they read. Because one thing I always emphasize is to keep an open mind and always look at the research. And by keeping an open mind, you're able to identify, and I always emphasize this to my students, that if you hold a position and you are shown through research that the position is flawed, then a change of position is required. So this is something that I constantly emphasize to my students, just to keep an open mind and always listen to an argument before basically shutting yourself down. And so when you're dealing with the current So here is, sorry about that. So here are the current events that I provided to my students. You had the executive orders on immigration, that basically the states are disagreeing with President Obama's executive order providing temporary legal status for certain immigrants within the confines of the United States. Regulations such as EPA regulations on hydrocarbon production, the Keystone Pipeline, that's a major area of contention. Court decisions on same-sex marriage and state law, federal versus state policy on marijuana laws, and individual rights, talking about the Oregon militia standoff. So these were just some current event examples that I provided to my students. A couple used I believe only 2 of these examples were actually used. So the students actually went on their own and decided to research things that they found interesting. But for the most part, that this whole lesson was extremely beneficial, because I taught my students a significant amount about basically persuasive and argumentative forms of the political process. And when you're researching an issue on government, that there are many different levels of speculation and criticism, and it's important to identify whether or not those levels of criticism are accurate and legitimate. So basically, I identified, the mitigating circumstances that I encountered during this lesson and during the 5 lessons that I have encountered. And also while sharing my the dilemmas that I encountered and the methods that I used in order to basically enhance my instruction in the context of mitigating those very circumstances that led to the dilemmas in the first place. So I wasn't necessarily prepared for them, but the information that I learned in this class and the classes that I've taken prior gave me the tools and equipped me to basically tackle these problems head on and deal with them within the confines of my classroom instruction. And that is my final and fifth fieldwork reflection for EDU 476.